President Donald Trump this week put weapons behind his growing irritation with Russian President Vladimir Putin's intransigence on negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Meeting at the White House with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, President Trump announced that the United States will work with European allies in NATO to send advanced weapon systems, including Patriot missile batteries, to Ukraine. He also threatened tariffs and additional sanctions against Russia and countries that do business with it if it doesn't ease its assault on Ukraine and make progress on stalled peace talks within 50 days. What impact is this policy shift likely to have on the war in Ukraine? Will the combination of military support for Ukraine and economic threats toward Russia succeed in forcing President Putin to the negotiating table? Or could they spur further escalation? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Viola Ginger, Washington senior editor at Just Security. Joining the show to discuss Trump's policy shift on Ukraine and its impact are Ambassador Daniel Fried and Dara Massicot. Ambassador Fried served as Special Assistant and the National Security Council Senior Director for Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and U.S. Ambassador to Poland, and was a key architect of U.S. sanctions policy toward Russia. He is currently the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dara Massicot is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and previously served as Senior Policy Researcher at the RAND Corporation and a Senior Analyst for Russian military capabilities at the Department of Defense. She's published extensively on Russian military capabilities, modernization efforts, and strategy. Thank you both for joining us today. Dan, let's start with you. President Trump's new policy marks a pretty distinct shift from his earlier stance against providing additional weapons to Ukraine. Putin and Zelensky have had their ups and downs, not least being President Trump's February blow-up in the Oval Office with President Zelensky. But this shift also seems to have been coming for a while. What do you see as the key factors driving this reversal?
It is a shift in policy. How much of a shift remains to be seen, because I haven't seen the details. We haven't seen the details of the weapons being shipped to Ukraine. Hopefully that's happening right now. And the economic steps against Russia that were put off for 50 days still don't seem to be ready for prime time. So critical issues remain a little vague, too vague for my taste. Still, you're right that this is a big shift from where we were on February 28th or around the 4th of July when the U.S. suddenly cut off arms shipments to Ukraine for pretty spurious reasons, some policy review. The decisions announced Monday put us in a much better place. I would have been happier had the White House put out a fact sheet about arms flows or the details of this arrangement with the Europeans, that NATO is going to have some role in coordinating. So a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of softness about it. As is often the case, Trump administration initiatives are announced grandly and thought through in stages, if you want to be generous. We're in a better place. How did we get to a better place? And I think if you have to thank one person, it would be Vladimir Putin, without whose arrogance and contempt and overreach, this might not have been possible. Vladimir Putin slapped down President Trump's efforts to arrange a ceasefire and try to get the war to stop. He slapped it down in an arrogant and presumptive fashion. And this Trump was unwilling to accept. And he should have been unwilling to accept it. He showed enormous and probably undue patience with Putin. But Putin lives in his own bubble of triumphalism and grievance and anger and imperial ambition. And I think Trump had had enough. It's not that President Trump has suddenly developed a devotion to the free world and America's role in maintaining it, but he certainly doesn't want to be seen as being somebody else's fool. And that's what Putin was doing. He was making President Trump look ridiculous, and Trump caught on. To some degree, Trump is following the pattern of past U.S. presidents, everyone who's dealt with Putin, and many U.S. presidents before who had to learn about the Kremlin. And so this isn't unique. Often, U.S. presidents approach Kremlin rulers thinking that they can make a deal if they're merely reasonable and take into account what they consider to be legitimate Russian interests. And it often doesn't work because what we consider to be legitimate Russian interests are nowhere near actual Kremlin ambitions. Such has been the case with Vladimir Putin since he became president starting January 1st, 2000. So this is Trump acting in a tradition of past American presidents, acting in his own fashion, which is some improvisation and policy announcements that later have to be implemented. But I'll still take it and say it's good news. Sorry to go on, Viola, but I've been thinking about this pretty hard for the last few days. There's a lot to say.
Understood. And it's really important background and context for all of this too. So let's back up a little bit. Speaking of background, Dara, can you give us a brief rundown of what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine right now? What's the situation?
Sure, and thanks for having me on the show. If we look at the state of the fighting right now, there are a few areas on the front lines that are of the most concern. The first being the situation in the Donbass of Ukraine, or the middle of the front line in Donetsk. The Russians have just about completed an encirclement of the key node of Pokrovsk. They've been hammering at this objective for about 18 months. And rather than assault it directly, because the Ukrainians have prepared some pretty sturdy defenses around the city, they're seeking to envelop it from the north and the south. And they unfortunately keep making slow but steady progress on that. And the situation is pretty critical there. There are a few other areas where Russia is seeking to replicate that encirclement approach slightly farther to the north. If we look also at the very northeastern part of Ukraine in the Sumy region, after the Ukrainians were withdrawn from Kursk in the Russian Federation, Russian forces came in after them to create some kind of buffer zone. And so there's some slight issues going on up there with defenses that weren't perhaps prepared sufficiently by the time the Russians came in. So that's the ground situation. I wouldn't say that there's anywhere on the front where the Russians are able to make a massive breakthrough at this point, but just looking at how they've allocated their forces, my greatest area of concern is what happens after Pokrovsk. What do they do with the remainder of what they can get accomplished by the end of the fighting season, which roughly ends in September, October. The other big thing that we're seeing in the last few months, since any type of peace negotiations with the Russians have not really led into any productive space, is we're seeing record numbers of nightly drone strikes on Ukraine to the tune of 500, 600, 800 Shahed drones and other type of Russian drones attacking Ukrainian military targets, infrastructure, cities, hospitals, every night. And the Russians have added additional explosives onto these drones, making them more incendiary, making them more damaging. And we're seeing these scenes play out every night. So, this is another hard summer for the Ukrainians. But again, I don't see evidence that the front lines are on the verge of collapse at any place. But there are a few sectors that I think are troubling.
Thank you. Yeah, the drone figures are just stunning, and the effect, unfortunately, has just been horrific. So thank you very much for that rundown. So can you explain to us a little bit your understanding of this weapons deal that Trump announced in the Oval Office on Monday? What do we know about how this will work, and what do we not know yet, and how long might it take for any of these munitions to reach Ukraine's front lines?
Well, to echo Dan, there's not a lot of details in terms of the implementation of this deal that are available. And from what I understand, I think they are building this airplane as it is flying. So the deal is announced, and by my understanding, the first tranche of deliveries will include Patriot systems, which are urgently needed to defend Ukrainian cities and populations. That probably will be coming from NATO allies who have Patriot batteries to give, and then they'll receive priority backfill from the United States. So money will be exchanged, and existing Patriots will be sent to Ukraine, and those countries will eventually receive a backfill from the United States. I don't actually know what the financial mechanics of this are yet, whether this is coming from individual countries or this is being purchased in some sort of NATO or EU mechanism. Those kind of details are still being worked out at the staff level, from what I understand. And I would say that it's pretty urgent that these staffs get going on this, because the rate of ammunition drawdown and the rate of U.S. assistance running pretty low is upon us. This is from previous authorizations under the Biden administration. That runs low. We're looking at September, October. So there's not a lot of time between now and then to make this seamless transition. I believe it can happen, but I'd like to underscore the necessary staff work at lower levels that has to accelerate dramatically to get this done in time.
Yeah, and that's a very complicated process too, and can just take time under the best of circumstances, right?
Yes, and there's plenty of people who have expertise doing this, but we're talking about multiple nations, collaborating, and there is architecture to do this that has been established for the last 3 years. So I'm confident they can get it done, but it does take a lot of legwork to execute this fully and on time.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear from each of you the effect you see this could potentially have on Ukraine's position, on its ability to fend off the Russians, or at least put it in a better position if and when negotiations resume. What are the odds, just briefly?
If the Trump administration puts its back into this initiative, and if the mechanism to implement it is in place, the weapons flow could help the Ukrainians in the near term, hold off the Russians, as Dara was talking about. If we're serious, and if the weapons flow is maintained, then Putin's expectation that he could convince Trump to abandon Ukraine will be destroyed. And Putin has been counting on getting the U.S. to break with Ukraine. It is rational in Putin's frame of reference for him to insist on Ukraine's surrender and maximal objectives as long as he thinks he has a reasonable chance of destroying or getting Trump to destroy U.S. support for Ukraine. Secondly, if the U.S. organizes itself to put serious economic pressure on Russia, in 50 days or sooner than 50 days, that will hurt the Russian economy. The Russian economy is vulnerable. The U.S. has some perfectly decent options for putting more pressure on Russia. Going after Russian oil revenues, there are various ways to do it. The Graham-Blumenthal bill isn't quite there yet. Some of the measures they've proposed, like massive tariffs on third countries that import Russian oil, are probably not practical. And some of the senators and certainly some of the staff realizes this. So, two big contingencies, right? Get the weapons flowing and keep them flowing, and crystallize our policy options for hitting the Russian economies. You do both, and Ukraine's in a very different position. If Putin's assumptions or his hopes for a U.S. failure of leadership and abandonment of Ukraine prove to be false, then he may have to settle. What was it, Kennan's famous line from the Long Telegram in 1946? The Kremlin is impervious to the logic of reason, but is highly sensitive to the logic of force. In other words, put a big stick on the table, whack them a few times with it, and then start the negotiations. The outline of a reasonable deal is already there. It's more or less a ceasefire in place. No formal recognition of Russian territorial conquests, but a de facto recognition that Ukraine's not going to get them back for a while, plus security arrangements for Ukraine. I'm for NATO membership, but if that isn't going to happen, something else needs to. That kind of a solution is attainable, and it would mark, actually, if we put our backs into it and kept free Ukraine free, would be a strategic defeat for Putin. He'd have temporary de facto occupation of about 20% of Ukraine. And so Ukraine becomes this century's West Germany. That was rough, ended up pretty badly for the Kremlin, don't you think? So we have the ability to get a pretty good outcome. And the Ukrainians would accept this, I think. But then Trump has to mean it. And until he means it, Putin is not going to play. It looked on Monday as if Trump means it, and that could end up we could end up in a pretty good position if the Monday announcements are crystallized, sharpened, and implemented. So my take of relative and potential optimism.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Dara, is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of what you see as the effect of these weapons on Ukraine's position?
Sure. I think what this deal does is it adds a lot of additional predictability for Ukraine in terms of what they think they'll be able to receive from the West by the United States being willing to sell equipment to Europeans who then transfer it to Ukraine. It allows them to do more long-term planning and not have to think about, things on a 3-month timeline. They can think on a longer timeline, which allows them to plan operations and surprise the Russians. In terms of the immediate outcome of some of these, sales, making sure that Ukraine has viable air defense systems is incredibly important, because when they have them at current levels, or hopefully more by the time these deals go through, the Russian Air Force won't fly too far forward in Ukraine because they are afraid of being shot down. And this is a decision. They are deterred from doing this because of their experience trying to engage these systems. It doesn't end up well for the Russian Air Force. So the Russian Air Force won't be able to go far forward and bomb cities or other targets. It means that the Russians will understand that a majority of their cruise and ballistic missiles will be intercepted and won't have the intended effect. If there is additional armor and artillery, it means that the Ukrainians will be able to hold their positions and inflict high costs on the Russians, even if they're using motorcycles and other mechanisms to try to make forward movement. It allows the Ukrainians to have access to some of the most top-notch fortifications that they know how to do. They just need more resources, and then we can provide some of our experience where it's relevant to help them with that, because that's a challenge to the Russians. It also helps them with border security, so the Russians don't try to make repeated incursions again from the northeast and the north. If this ultimately includes additional precision-guided munitions like more ATACMS, more Gimler launchers, or even some of the rumors I've seen in the press of the JASSM air-launched cruise missiles, which ride on the F-16s, this can really complicate Russia's ability to launch a lot of attacks, at least from a certain region in Russia. So it will have a tangible effect on Ukraine's ability to hold its position. But I think the big thing here is the opportunity that we're seeing with this kind of deal is that a long-term investment needs to be made into the U.S. defense industrial base, and not just for this situation in Ukraine. This is a global issue, so the United States can meet its obligations. And simply put, missile defenses save lives. We've seen it in Israel. We've seen it in Ukraine. The United States has great systems. Germany has some as well, but they don't have that large production capacity because they need long-term investments to build out factories and hire workers and really get this cranked up to the level that it needs for American defense, European defense, in Ukrainian defense. So that's my soapbox on the opportunity that this presents for our collective defense.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Dan, from your experience in alliance management, when we're talking about NATO here, this is not NATO buying these weapons, but members of NATO individually buying them from the United States and either replacing weapons that they provide to Ukraine or sending those weapons on to Ukraine. How do you see this affecting alliance management in the alliance, just briefly?
Well, I hope that the Trump administration checked with key allies, particularly the Germans, about buying weapons and got a green or greenish light. Because if we have to negotiate this from scratch, it will be delayed and there will be a backlash against Trump overpromising and underdelivering. But if there are arrangements in place, even if they have to be finalized, but if there's a political level agreement that this is going to happen, it could work out fine. This is doable. Remember that NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte was in the Oval Office, and he was not caught by surprise. He knew what Trump was announcing. He validated and endorsed the weapons portion of it. And he suggested that there's a mechanism in place. NATO will do some kind of coordinating job. So this is possible, okay? It's not tricky. It's not easy. It involves money. Weapons are always complicated, especially big ones. But I felt better about it on Monday, seeing that Mark Rutte was in the Oval and nodding vigorously and adding his endorsement, his concurrence in what was happening and his co-ownership of it. So it's doable. Not easy, but doable.
Great. That's really helpful. Let's turn to the U.S. piece of this and the sanctions just briefly. Dan, how do these threats from President Trump on tariffs, secondary tariffs, further sanctions, secondary sanctions, how does that track with the sanctions legislation going through Congress right now that apparently has support from most senators, more than 80, and even from House Speaker Mike Johnson, is my understanding, right?
The Graham-Blumenthal bill has one big club, Section 17, which provides for mandatory 500% tariffs imposed upon any third country that buys Russian energy. It's more or less what it says. 500% tariffs are an either imperfect or completely impractical tool. Are we really going to impose 500% tariffs on China if it buys Russian oil, or India? And how does this fit with our other trade negotiations with them? Now, my practical objection isn't just me. There is a general understanding on Capitol Hill that the legislation as originally put together is not practical, and an impractical club is no club at all. The good news is the members and staff are working to revise it. One problem is that the Trump White House loves tariffs. And Senators Graham and Blumenthal want to get this over the finish line. And so I suspect they like the optics of a club, which includes the word tariffs. But they've got to make some fix to make this more deployable. Now, these are not terrible problems to have. This is fixable. My own preferred option would be to borrow from what the Congress forced down the throats of the Obama administration, which was threats of secondary sanctions, not tariffs, against third countries that purchased Iranian oil. And the Chinese and the Indians screamed and yelled and protested, but they actually respected the prohibition because it came with a carve-out. If a country significantly reduced every 6 months its purchases of Iranian oil, hey, no secondary sanctions. So you see where I'm going with this, right? a similar model might work. The purpose is not purity. The purpose is to take money out of the Kremlin war machine, and to do so without causing a panic in energy markets. So the Iran precedent suggests maybe this formula might work. Look, this is not the only formula. There may be others, but the fact is we now have up to 50 days to get this right, and we better get it right, because not imposing restrictions on Russia's chief export earner at this stage is policy malpractice. We need to do it, and it is doable. So let's hope that gets straightened out. But it's the announcement in the Oval Office was laudable for its intention to hit the Russians on the economic side, and not ready for prime time in its details.
Are there any other risks, and this is a question for both of you, any other risks that we should be looking out for as all of this unfolds? Dara, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. The Russians will always try to compel the United States and its NATO allies and any other global allies from providing military assistance to Ukraine. And we've seen them over the past 3.5 years make nuclear threats over 24 times, or possibly even more. The Russians were opposed to any type of ATACMS being provided to Ukraine. They were opposed to extended range TACMS being provided to Ukraine. They were opposed to F-16s being provided. They were opposed to any strikes on Russia proper that come from U.S. weaponry. And all of those things have happened, and the response has been no escalation, or if there has been escalation, it has been a few accelerated strike patterns against Ukraine, but nothing outside of that. So again, with this announcement, we've already started seeing some rumors and murmurs from the Russians about how escalatory it is. But again, I think we need to put this in context. They're always trying to frighten allies. They're always trying to coerce the United States into being afraid about escalation, and then the escalation never comes. I'm not saying that there's no risk, but again, if we look at their pattern and how that they have absorbed these kind of blows or these kind of decisions being implemented, and this is the pathway that we're on. The line that they're holding, the Russians is that we, the Kremlin, are opposed to any basing, NATO basing inside Ukraine. We don't want any boots on the ground, and they don't want any extended range munitions being provided to the Ukrainians. So these are things like extended range JASM, which have 1,000-kilometer plus, or Tomahawks, which are 1,600 kilometers. If the Ukrainians had those, speaking about the JASM extended range, they could hit Moscow. But those are those are assets that I'm not sure that our government is really putting on the table to provide Ukraine at this point in time. So just like the Russians are going to make a lot of noise, and a lot of it is chaff. And I think looking at their past behavior, it just keeps us steady and keeps us on course of what we need to do. So I'll end with that.
And part of that also is a factor of their capacity to escalate beyond Ukraine, right? And the risks to that, of course, is something that they have to take into account too, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen time and again that they've put a red line out. The United States will provide Ukrainian with weaponry, and then the world moves on. I think we should anticipate that they're going to make a lot of noise about this, but also just keep in mind that they have no interest or capability in challenging NATO at this time.
Okay, good. It's very important to have in mind in the context. Dan, one other piece of news that came out of Ukraine this week is a shakeup in the government there. President Zelensky said that he wants to replace Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, who's been in that post since 2020, with Yulia Svyrydenko. She's been deputy prime minister and helped lead negotiations with the Trump administration this spring on that minerals deal. The Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, still has to approve that, but Zelensky's party holds a majority, so it's likely to move forward. And the current prime minister would become the new defense minister. And the current defense minister, Rustem Umerov, would become Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, replacing Oksana Markarova, who's been quite effective as a representative for Ukraine. What should we make of these changes?
I share your assessment that Ambassador Makarov has been effective. I think 5 years as prime minister of Ukraine is a lot. So I can understand that the prime minister might want a break. The deputy PM, the person said to be the successor, has worked with the United States. I know her. She is sharp as hell, smart, capable, committed. It looks, there is an interpretation for which I have some respect, that this is Zelensky's way of aligning his government to be as effective as possible in dealing with the Trump administration. That makes sense. Now, Ukraine has to work with Europe as well as Washington, and Europe at least as much, if not more, than Washington. And it needs to try to fix things with Poland, where relations have gotten a bit stuck. But this is a far better place than we were on February 28th, right? The Oval Office blow up. Remember, as we assess the Trump moves toward Ukraine and Ukrainian counter moves, just how bad things started out as. There's a serious part of the Trump world that regards Ukraine as a waste of American energy. We ought to cut it off. There are people who say so, people who make those arguments. And a couple of weeks ago, we saw that argument in practice with the sudden and ill-explained cutoff of American arms for Ukraine. Cut off because what? We were doing a general policy review? Seriously? So look where we are now. We have a better set of problems than the ones we had in the first weeks of the Trump administration.
That's a good way of framing this. So just to close out here, I just want to ask each of you to talk about very briefly, what are the one or two key things that you're going to be looking for going forward from this point? Dara, let's start with you, and then Dan, if you could perhaps wrap it up.
I'm looking at the Russian summer offensive. It's already underway, and just trying to determine how far they're going to be able to try to go this summer. The Ukrainians have developed technological countermeasures to try to make up for manpower shortfalls on the front line using drones and combat robotics. It is frustrating to the Russians. They don't have a solution yet. And so they're moving forward at high cost in terms of casualties. And the numbers are, casualty-wise, what we would consider pretty catastrophic. But the Russians seem to have, accepted this as the norm, and they continue to push. So I'm concerned about what's happening in the Donbass, particularly around that critical pivot point of Pokrovsk. But I was concerned about that last summer as well, and the Ukrainians have held the line. So, just trying to make sure the lines stay stable while this new weapons deal is solidified and there's not an interruption to any type of weapons supply or intelligence support that's being provided at this point. So I'm trying to see what's going to happen and see where we're at by October.
That's terrific. Dan, what about you? What are you going to be looking for next?
Well, first, to be clear, Dara is spot on right. Everything has to start with measuring the battlefield. That is the key factor. It hasn't moved a lot, but the danger of a Russian breakthrough is always there. So first check that, and I think her assessment of the relative dangers is spot on. Where we are is tactically uncertain, but strategically poised to have a success if we, the Americans, plus the Europeans, can put our backs into it. What strikes me is that the upside potential here is much greater than it is in other problems in the world. there are no U.S. troops on the ground, and we have the opportunity to help the Ukrainians defeat the Russians, which would be a major defeat for Putinism, the weaker but more virulent and hostile of our great power rivals. Now, that looks to me like a damn good success if we can get there. There are parts of the American political establishment who ask what strategic interests we have in Ukraine. And by the way, that's not just the Trump part. I remember in 2014, the Obama White House was asking me some of the same questions when I was in government. Okay? Well, the interest we have in Ukraine is pretty clear to me. It's the same interest we had in Europe in World Wars I, II, and the Cold War, which is that we didn't want aggressive autocrats to dominate Europe. Okay? That's a pretty solid interest, especially since we need Europe to deal with China, and we can achieve a success. Now, with that in mind, let's put our backs into it, starting with addressing the problems that Dara has accurately, it seems to me, identified. Help the Ukrainians on the battlefield, put more pressure on the Russians economically, and show the Kremlin that, in fact, they are playing a loser's game, and then help them lose.
Thank you both so much. That was just so much packed into that time, and your analysis is just really invaluable. Really appreciate your insights. Dara, Dan, thank you. This episode was hosted by me, Viola Ginger, and produced by Maya Neer and Clara Apt, with help from Isaac Rubenstein. Special thanks to Ambassador Daniel Freed and Dara Massicot. You can read all of Just Security's coverage on the Russia-Ukraine war at justsecurity.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.